Welcome. Today we will uncover the secrets of the Japanese bomber G4M Betty, an aircraft that became a symbol of Japan's strategic ambitions and catastrophic mistakes at the beginning of World War II. The entire service history of this tsunami, from its first combat missions to its final flights, hides secrets that could forever change our understanding of history. Imagine, in January 1945, at Clark Air Base, an almost intact, unaltered G4M was discovered, causing shock and bewilderment among analysts. Why did this bomber, designed for maximum speed and range, without armor or defensive systems, turn out to be a weapon of self-destruction? Did Japanese engineers deliberately sacrifice their crews to achieve greater long-range capabilities? How did it happen that a plane intended to be elusive and invincible became a symbol of strategic failure, claiming hundreds of pilots' lives and destroying entire fleets? And most importantly, why did the initial plan, based on speed and range, lead to catastrophic losses that shook Japan's entire strategy? In this investigation, we piece together disparate facts to present you with a complete picture where ambition and folly clashed in a brutal struggle, revealing who truly orchestrated this war. Are you ready to see the truth hidden in archives? Then let's begin. In the memory of those who have ever faced the history of World War II, the image of the Japanese bomber G4M, known as Betty, has become a symbol of relentless pursuit of speed and range. But what if everything we knew about it was only part of a complex myth, created to serve national pride and strategic bravado? What is hidden behind the brightly painted wings, behind the glorious legend that has shaped perceptions of Japanese pilots and engineers for centuries? And why, in the early years of this conflict, did this aircraft seem like the unchallenged king of air combat, but over time grew into a more provocative and contradictory figure? The answer to these questions lies at the very heart of an unspoken truth, and it, as usual, is hidden in raw facts, in revelations that modern analysts have filled with truth without embellishment. Never before in the history of military aviation had such an example been found. A whole, completely undamaged Mitsubishi G4M Betty, discovered at Clark Air Base in the heart of Luzon, which from the first glance appeared as an example of engineering perfection, stored in the shadows of oblivion for half a century. This aircraft was not just waiting for its time. It became a kind of living laboratory. Its cylindrical shape, nearly 20 meters in length, the wingspan reminiscent of a dream about a keen designer. Everything about it spoke of speed, range, and technical excellence. Inside the wings, completely unprotected fuel tanks were discovered, that is, unshielded, without any armor, fire suppression systems, or basic safety measures. How could such bravery, or rather recklessness, form the basis of such a grand concept? It's hard to imagine anyone at the start of the war fully grasped the scale of the upheaval. After all, during those years when the flag of supremacy soared over Japanese aviation, their doctrine was built on speed and range, an astonishing combination for that time. The entire concept went beyond traditional limits, reducing weight, abandoning heavy armor, and eliminating protective systems. Why? As everyone knew, these decisions were conscious choices, born of a carefully thought-out strategy designed to maximize combat efficiency and extend long-range patrol capabilities. Japanese engineers were driven by a passion for rapid technological development, for removing everything unnecessary, even if it meant risking the lives of crews. When experts first saw this discovery, their thoughts were immediately filled with questions. Why were such vulnerable elements, such obvious weaknesses, deliberately left unprotected? What logic lay behind this risky decision? And most importantly, how did it affect the fate of the pilots and commanders themselves? Why did Japanese engineers, men whose vows were always dedicated to perfection, take such risks? Finding an intact and unnoticed bomber was a revelation that stirred minds. It was a feeling of wild and staggering contradiction. At a time when the American aviation industry was just beginning to battle similar threats, the Japanese Betty appeared as if it embodied a living manifestation of the race to push beyond physical limits. But these technological choices, combined with the rejection of traditional armor, fire suppression systems, and protective elements, are part of a broader strategy. A strategy that prioritized speed and range, neglecting extra systems that seemed nothing more than additional cargo, hindering the achievement of objectives. This doctrine, based on maximum speed and range, became a kind of symbol of the Japanese approach to war: fast, daring, provocative, and dangerous, yet at the same time, profoundly flawed. The decision not to arm the aircraft with protection, not to install fire suppression systems, and not to reinforce fuel tanks was no accident, no oversight. It was a deliberate act, the result of deep analysis, because even during the Soviet years, amid the arms race, engineers understood that every innovation had a cost. In this case, that cost was the lives of pilots and crews who were forced to fight not only the enemy, but also their own fate, which they had decided upon without much ceremony. Part 3 of 14. The pursuit of maximum range, speed, and agility became the embodiment of Japanese aviation philosophy, which prioritized evasion over defense, avoidance over interception. These strategic decisions, driven by careful calculation, turned the aircraft from merely a machine into an unexpected symbol of strategic error. A shadow loomed over it. Was the price paid for lightning-fast efficiency justified? When victory meant not only tactical superiority, but also complete vulnerability of the crews, that's where the root of the entire drama lay. This fact forever changed the understanding of the consequences that can arise from betting on a technological race and the idea of unarmored, vulnerable machines that rely solely on speed rather than robust protection. Turning points in history demonstrate such decisions can lead to strategic catastrophe, and paradoxically, this very discovery, the intact and unscathed G4M, became a powerful testament to the fact that even the boldest ideas born from a desire for dominance can turn into tragedy. And as a reminder of contentious military decisions, which despite all evidence and testimony, continued to shape an image of war leading to death rather than victory. Evidence, analysis, and historical practice all indisputably show that flawed strategic choices based solely on speed and range, without considering crew protection and safety, ultimately doomed to inevitable ruin. And it was precisely this transformation of power into defeat that became the key to understanding the entire tragedy of the Japanese aviation industry, and essentially an illustration of how technological progress, rooted in satisfying only the most blatant mercantile priorities, can negate all achievements. Ultimately, who bears the cost of such strategy? The pilot or the engineering team? What is the price of a race that the whole country came to value, and which nearly the entire history could have subdued with this unthinkable cost? And so, with each new discovery and analysis, it becomes clearer. It was these engineering choices, these conscious risks, that played a crucial role during the war. They were not merely technical aspects. They became the embodiment of a mindset that, in essence, posed the question whether it is worth risking everything to win the speed race. And the outcome? We already know it. It has become a warning to future generations that more speed does not always mean greater strength, because sometimes the most destructive delusion hides in extremes. On December 1st, 1941, the hours still stretched toward dawn when ominous hums of aircraft engines sounded on the horizon. Off the rugged coast of the Pacific, on Formosa Island, now Taiwan, Japanese Air Force had already begun the decisive, stern implementation of their new tactical doctrine. This was not an ordinary aircraft, not just a machine for bombing or reconnaissance. It was the G4M, known as the Betty, a light strategic bomber with a unique range, an aircraft capable of reaching the most distant targets, able to cut through fire and flames to deliver a strike that would change the course of the war. And it was this plane that became a symbol, not so much of victory, as of the danger looming over the Allies. It was a morning when the world still did not suspect how profoundly this machine would alter its fate. The Japanese Aviation Command on Formosa prepared an operation that would forever be remembered as the beginning of the Pacific Campaign. At dawn, with precision only predictable to those who understand strategic calculations, 26 G3Ms, Gesta planes, and 82 Bettys took to the air. Their mission was to strike enemy frontline bases, destroy aerial hostile forces, and deliver a blow that would be devastating in its suddenness and power. Among them, precisely the Betty, took off from strips shrouded in seafoam, heading toward their next target, which initially seemed protected by a strong defensive system. But what truly made this aircraft special was its range. It could fly over 460 miles without refueling, a feat unattainable by most American competitors of that time. Its design contained more than just technological innovation. It was a true strategic weapon, enabling the Japanese to attack from unexpected angles, to target the enemy's weak spots. The scene of the combat takeoff was etched in the memories of many witnesses. Engines roared loudly. The air was churned up by whirlwinds. Pilots inside, some nervously, like children, others calmly, all understood that today the fate of the Pacific War would be decided. And so in flight, the roar of engines sounded like a symbol of a new era, an era when range became the key to victory. Within minutes of the attack, the Bettys reached their targets. The ominous sound of torpedoes soaring through the air was both threatening and mesmerizing. Time was rapidly tightening, because earlier that same day, 82 G4Ms were moving purposefully toward the American base in the Philippines, Clark Field. On the land runways, in the pale dusty light, appearing as ordinary little planes, they concealed true catalysts of upheaval. The attack began precisely when the Allies believed that the bases in the Gulf of Leyte were securely protected. But the Japanese knew. Their aircraft were not just means of destruction, but dangerous weapons, capable of annihilating enemy aviation and defenses with deadly precision. A terrifying symmetry. 58 planes, nearly the entire Japanese air fleet, fighting for dominance in the air. The result? Utter destruction. 58 Japanese aircraft, stealthy and swift, penetrated the base. The strike was as precise as it was destructive. In the air, death and chaos. On the ground, explosions, burning aircraft, and debris scattered across the runway. Many American aircraft, many still in the early stages of their development, were destroyed or rendered inoperable beyond repair. Evidence from those years shows mutilated hulls, shattered equipment, and smoking ruins. What is particularly impressive is that such destructive effects were achieved thanks to the aircraft's range, which allowed a major in the cockpit to solve tasks previously thought impossible. It was not just an attack, it was a precise, lightning-fast strike, the result of high tactical training and the use of maximum advantageous factors. This event shocked both American commanders and politicians. Each subsequent historical assessment emphasizes that it was the range and effectiveness of the Betty that played a key role in the start of a series of Japanese victorious military operations. But at the very moment when the Allies realized the scale of the threat, a trail of questions arose. How, just a few hours after the war began, could a single strategic aircraft change the balance of power? Why was this particular plane, the Betty, the weapon capable of inflicting such irreparable damage? And what if these aircraft had reached their targets at that moment, invulnerable and superior? The heart of these questions lies not only in engineering or tactics. This story is about moments when luck and technological superiority combined to predetermine the outcome of a battle. In the 12th month of the war, in 1942, the Bettys ceased to be just kerosene machines. They penetrated deep into enemy territory, shifted naval battles, and created an illusion of impregnable defense, which, through tragic irony, soon became their own threat. In July, during one of the most famous operations, an aircraft aimed at attacking British ships, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, launched a torpedo attack that destroyed them in open sea. This moment became a historical symbol. For the first time in naval history, An aerial torpedo strike by enemy aircraft destroyed combat ships while underway. Witness accounts immortalize the scene. Ships sinking into the fog in their final minutes, mercilessly struck down by fire. The whole world learned about the power of aircraft in naval combat, about new war frontiers where certain Betty planes became the wet death for the largest flagships. Simultaneously, as they increased their range and tactical effectiveness, Betty planes became an integral part of Japan's strategy to seize territories: Australia, New Guinea, and numerous islands. Each new breakthrough mission proved that the Japanese command relied on this strategic weapon to keep the enemy in constant alarm, to expand their occupied positions, and to accelerate their advance. In every battle, it was clear: the plane was not only a means of killing, but also a symbol of superiority and intimidation. And the enemies? Part 6 of 14. They were forced to react, sometimes without the chance to respond, because the range of the Japanese Betty, combined with its combat reliability, made it virtually invincible. All these facts, evidence, proof, and actual indicators show why the Betty became not just an aircraft in those years, but a formidable weapon. Its tactical superiority was not only a technical achievement, but also a reflection of a deep strategic vision. The successes achieved in the early years of the war were a prestigious testament to this very strength. But a reasonable question arises: why did the initial victory ultimately turn into a threat? Why did what was conceived as Japan's future eventually become its internal enemy? And why, despite all its advantages, did the Betty become a symbol of fleeting victory, which could have led to catastrophe? This is a story about the seductive and dangerous range, which transformed a powerful weapon into a force of uncertainty. In the rhetoric and drama of World War II, it was these aircraft, the Betty, that would forever remain symbols of an entire stage of the war, when advantages embodied in range and tactical power ultimately destroyed themselves. In the early 1940s, when the world was on the verge of global catastrophe, hopes for technological superiority seemed to be the only chance for survival. Military engineers and strategists, facing unpredictable frontline challenges, worked under constant pressure. Their focus was on creating a powerful and fast bomber capable of dominating the air, executing complex missions, and surviving in fierce air combat. That is why the project named Betty was conceived as the result of the bold ambition of Japanese military engineering. However, behind the brilliant facade of modernization, deep structural flaws lurked, which over time became fatal. These were errors that may have seemed justified at the design stage, but later turned into fangs. Fangs capable of consuming not only the combat value of the aircraft, but also hundreds of lives. Undoubtedly, one of the most alarming issues in the Betty's design was its vulnerability to explosions from minimal damage. In 1942, pilots flying over the Pacific began to notice strange and horrifying scenes. Even slight damage, which did not lead to a serious loss of flying capability, often ended in disaster. The aircraft, once considered powerful and formidable, gained a bad reputation in military circles due to its nicknames, Zippo, or Cameo Lighter. These emblems pointed to the design's shortcomings. These were machines that could easily turn into flaming graves. It was evident that damage, even that which other aircraft or minor collisions should not have disabled, led to explosions. And all of this was because the fuel tanks located inside the fuselage were completely unprotected. They seemed to be an open challenge to all laws of engineering. Without protective systems, without tanks capable of withstanding even minor damage, these vulnerabilities did not go unnoticed. In October 1942, amid fierce battles unfolding in the Australian and New Guinea theaters, the situations involving Betty took on a catastrophic scale. Passing through air raids and dogfights, Japanese bombers inevitably encountered Allied fighters, American and Australian. From time to time, they clashed or engaged in tight dogfights, and the results were clear. Betty would either explode, turning into flames, or burn out, leaving behind only charred debris. The evidence collected later by strafers and pilots on the battlefield confirmed that the aircraft's design intentionally lacked advanced fuel protection systems. This was a strategic choice made by military engineers. Aiming for speed and payload, they excluded everything that could slow down or complicate production. After the losses that could no longer be ignored, the Allies began examining the damaged Bettys captured at Australian and New Guinea airfields. It was precisely among these wreckage remains that irrefutable proof was found: the absence of any basic fuel safety features. Studying these aircraft, specialists discovered that the engineers who designed Betty deliberately refused to include systems capable of reducing the risk of explosion. A revelation was made that undermined the entire strategic logic. The balance between speed, payload, and safety had been intentionally broken. Ultimately, it was concluded that these fires and disasters were not accidental, but the result of systematic design errors. Sometimes, to mitigate losses, temporary and partial measures were introduced. Most notably, the addition of rubber protective sheets swiftly placed inside fuel tanks. These measures seemed like a temporary relief, reducing losses without addressing the core vulnerabilities of the design. However, the tragedy was that these measures only had a cosmetic effect. They could not tackle the root of the problem: the lack of safety systems, based on the initial assumption that the aircraft would survive anyway, thus not contaminating the militaristic combat purpose. So why did it turn out this way? Why did military leaders, facing risks, prefer to gamble hundreds of lives instead of addressing obvious weaknesses? What strategic calculations and engineering assumptions led to the creation of such an inherently vulnerable combat aircraft? Why reject standard fuel protection systems, the very systems that could have saved hundreds, even thousands of lives? This is the main question confronting us. It was not merely a technical mistake, but the result of a whole system of decisions made under conditions of limited resources, a technological race, limited time, and pressure. The question of why such obvious risks were justified, and possibly even inspired the creation of this vulnerable machine, remains unanswered. Within this story lies not only technical discrepancies and design miscalculations, but also a reflection of the strategic policy, the political climate, and the military psychology of an entire nation. After all, a flawed decision embedded by engineers into an aircraft's design is not merely a technical mistake. It is a tragedy, with the cost being the loss of thousands of lives. It is a tragedy that definitively confirms that, in war as in life, the price of errors is often too high. The consequences of these mistakes can be fatal, paralyzing even the most powerful and fierce fighters. It was from these errors, from this mistaken idea, that the story emerged, one that would forever remain part of the tragic history of World War II. In the late 1930s, when the titanic naval race for dominance in the Pacific was just gathering momentum, the Japanese Imperial Navy recognized the need to develop new aerial assets. The task was strict. They needed a bomber capable of operating at extremely long distances, with exceptional speed characteristics, and with a payload capacity that would enable it to deliver powerful strikes on enemies beyond the reach of defenses. Time was pressing, and the stakes were incredibly high. Engineers and designers faced a challenge that initially seemed impossible: to combine range, speed, and payload capacity without making the aircraft excessively heavy and thus vulnerable. But precisely under these conditions, against the backdrop of mounting demands and strict strategic pressure, a man emerged who was willing to risk everything: Kiro Honjo, head of one of Japan's largest design bureaus, Mitsubishi. He refused compromises, rejected traditional protection systems, and focused solely on speed and range. He chose to follow a path where no soft concessions or compromises existed. His decision was to abandon armor, and also to forego protective systems and fire suppression functions, automatic fuel isolation, which could have reduced the aircraft's weight. He adopted an ironclad rule: lightweight airframe, minimal systems, maximum speed. This led to a design fully focused on weight minimization. The crucial fact was that all money and effort were concentrated precisely on the ability to cut through time and space for strategic superiority. Their aircraft was essentially a flying missile with wings, lacking armor, designed solely for its pilots, whose unyielding resilience, bravery, and experience were the only defenses. In 1939, after lengthy testing, the prototype that fully met the requirements first took to the skies, filling the crew with the sensation of an unrivaled speed monster, left unprotected, devoid of standard onboard systems, but prepared to push beyond all limits of possibility. Part 9 of 14. The first aircraft was built upon the hopes of most, with confidence in victory igniting the hearts of the designers. But the price of this feeling was exceptional vulnerability. By the late 1930s, when the Jiraishi model took off from the runway, it was clear. This was a terrible weapon, a marvel of speed, but also incredibly fragile. The entire model was produced in large quantities, and by the end of the second year of the war, nearly 200 such aircraft were in service. Every one of these aircraft was shrouded in tragedy. For pilots, it was a risk they knew and accepted. Strategic requirements, prioritizing speed and range, placed them at the brink of life and death, on the edge of monstrous losses. Why was this decision made? Why did the command and engineers take such risks, tempt fate? Why did they accept the sacrifice of crews to achieve a strategic goal? The answer, difficult to accept at first. Behind the idea of maximum range and speed, the ability to strike the enemy even in the most remote points, was the decision to pay with the blood of countless pilots. This choice was not only a reflection of the technological challenge of its time, it was a mirror of an era when strategy, distorted by unwavering faith in technology, took precedence over human life. When strategy became equivalent to the fate of pilots, their heroes and sacrificial lives. What happened to those pilots whose fates were so closely intertwined with this technological experiment? Where is the line between genius and madness, between strategy and blind pursuit of speed? The answers lie in the analysis of facts, in irrefutable evidence. These machines, these aircraft, were created with one sole purpose: to break through tactical capabilities despite their obvious vulnerability. Their story is a narrative about a cost beyond reason, about the price of strategic progress that burned human lives. What price was paid for the dream of unreachable speed and unattainable range? How did these decisions alter the course of the war, the fate of crews? How did they influence heroism and tragedy? The answers require not only reconstructing facts, they demand thoughtful analysis, internal assessment. To what extent was such risk justified, and how did the chosen tactics influence the outcome of battles, the naval war as a whole? This is a story about technological racing, about strategic ambition that went beyond reason, about people executing the will of their era. And within this story, not only facts, evidence, and figures, lies an eternal dilemma. Is the price worth the genius and progress? And what legacy will this price leave? In the fates of heroes, in the balances of naval battles, in history, which is written not only by political and technical decisions, but also by the sacrifices behind them, their silent heroism and tragedies, unheard voices. In the dark corridors of World War II aviation history, there are not only heroic feats and technological achievements. Where dedication to the cause meets technical mistakes, tragedies are born, leaving scars not only in flight protocols, but also in the lives of millions. This struggle is especially evident in the case of Japanese naval aviation, whose style and tactics were shaped and simultaneously undermined by its own structural weaknesses. At the center of attention is the aircraft that became a symbol of the Japanese Air Forces, the Betty. This machine is not merely a piece of scrap metal in engineering solutions. It embodies a concept, an ideology, and a sometimes tragically imperfect system that determined the fate of hundreds of crews and influenced the course of battles in the Pacific theater of operations. When Japanese engineers and commanders began mass-producing bombers and reconnaissance aircraft, their goal was to create a versatile aircraft capable of performing a wide range of missions: bombing, reconnaissance, patrol. During the years when the Japanese fleet and aviation demonstrated strength and initiative, and technological ideas were advancing rapidly, the Betty was a vivid example of ambition. However, these bright technologies and new ideas came at a price: human lives and combat effectiveness. In 1942, the third year of the war, as American and Australian forces enthusiastically engaged in combat, Japanese bombers faced harsh reality. Sometimes their flights ended in disaster even before taking off. More often, these aircraft were lost in battle, victims of their own design. Losses during the initial years of the campaign in the Guadalcanal Strait and on the Pacific Front were staggering. Over 100 aircraft were lost in battles for the islands, and their crews consisted of hundreds of young, often inexperienced pilots whose fates were forever linked with death. Evidence shows that most tragedies were caused by vulnerable fuel tanks and lack of protection. Such vulnerabilities made the aircraft fast and maneuverable, but simultaneously turned them into easy targets for enemies. An encounter with an American or Australian fighter could instantly turn a display of aviation power into mourning. As speed increased and maneuvers became impossible, the Betty became merely a target, incapable of protecting its pilots from missile salvos or aimed gunfire. Understanding this fact did not happen overnight. After a series of heavy defeats and mass catastrophes, the Japanese command began seeking solutions, as losing an entire air fleet meant losing a strategic position. In 1943, rubber sheets were introduced into the aircraft's construction, hoping this would reduce fuel tank damage. A year later, more radical measures were adopted: the installation of self-sealing tanks. However, these innovations not only failed to provide the desired level of protection, but also caused a significant decline in flight performance. The range shrank, the speed decreased, the operational zone became smaller, and therefore, the ability to carry out combat missions grew increasingly limited. As a result, despite efforts and technological advancements, the fundamental weaknesses of the design remained, like a wound that refused to heal. As the war approached its end in the autumn and winter of 1944 and 1945, Betty's role fully changed its status. In daytime battles, where the enemy operated with superior speed and preparation, these aircraft lost their combat significance. They were no longer used as attacking forces, and the number of such planes decreased too rapidly to be considered anything more than a strategic decline. They became relics of the past, reminders of a strategy that, in practice, had only the illusion of protection, but could not withstand enemy dominance. American reconnaissance and pilots, observing the numerous losses of Japanese aircraft, quickly understood Betty was nothing more than a strategic gamble, justified only in theory, because in practice it offered only an illusion of security without any real opposition. As soon as the enemy entered combat and began actively attacking, the planes fell one after another, turning into easy targets. This revealed not only a technological and tactical deficiency, but also an unrepentant conceptual miscalculation rooted deep within Japanese command. What was the potential of this design, and what was its true value? Could one believe that the ends justified the means when the cost was lives, shattered destinies, and broken futures? What led to the death of hundreds of young pilots who perished due to a flawed concept? The answer seems to lie deep within strategy itself, in its shortcomings and mistakes born of the specific conditions of the time and technological standards. Constant losses of Japanese aircraft were not just statistics or facts in war chronicles. They were testimony to the internal conflicts tearing apart the entire concept of combat effectiveness. The strategic thinking based on the assumption that enhanced protection would overcome technical and tactical weaknesses proved to be an illusion. And the more it became clear that the weaknesses of the design were an insurmountable obstacle to victory, the more apparent the tragedy became. This intricate network of decisions and errors, each aircraft with a double structural weakness, it was not merely a technical mishap. It was a symbol, showing that in wartime, even the most advanced ideas could turn into fatal, irresponsible decisions. If one tries to trace the consequences of these flawed technical developments and strategic choices, the answer is clear to the untrained eye. These decisions cost the lives of hundreds of pilots, their tragic fates and immense suffering. That is the price paid by the Japanese military machine for its conceptual blindness. And if we analyze the collected facts in the context of a broader picture, it can be confidently said that their cost was too high. Because in war, not only strategies determine the outcome, but also human lives. And how many lives were lost? How many young pilots never returned home because their aircraft, imperfect in design, seemed almost foretold the tragedy itself? Over time, it became clear that the problem was not only in technology or tactical thinking. The main weakness was the very concept that justified risk for the illusion of a safe front. This is not only the tragedy of Betty, but, in a broader sense, a lesson of history. What happens when strategic decisions are made without proper assessment of their critical weaknesses, and when everything, either in the name of saving costs or creating an illusion of protection, comes at the expense of human lives? Ultimately, understanding this issue is the key to unraveling how past mistakes can serve as lessons for the future, and how crucial it is to prevent a recurrence of a tragedy that has already earned its terrifying reputation. All this history is not just about aircraft, vulnerable tanks, or inefficient decisions. It is a reminder of what neglecting obvious weaknesses can lead to, when the stakes involve not only technical performance, but also the fates of people whose lives have been sacrificed by errors and illusions. After all, how many such stories remain behind the scenes? How many uncertain destinies and forgotten names will forever linger in the shadows of these tragedies? And behind all this lies a relentless question. Could more have been saved if engineers and leaders had recognized their own mistakes earlier? Perhaps then, the price of lost lives would have been lower. But alas, the lessons of history follow their harsh schedule, leaving behind only monuments and silent reminders of those who perished without justice or understanding. In distant April of 1943, the fate of the Japanese naval fleet was on the verge of transformation. On that day, when every captain and pilot understood that their missions might be their last, the Betty aircraft, which played a role not only in battles but also in the destinies of entire nations, became a symbol of a strategy that relentlessly drove Japan toward catastrophe. This craft, which endured numerous trials in its short life, embodied not only military strength, but also a conflict of ideas. Had war become an idiom of survival at any cost, even at the expense of crews? Or was there a tragedy hidden inside this wooden monster whose price proved to be too high? A human life pushed away like a terrible shadow looming over Japanese aircraft engineering. The tragic illustration of this divide was the mission in April 1943, when Betty, previously filled with hope and apprehension, carried out an operation that forever changed history. That day, the pilots, immersed in the silence of their cockpit, knew. Their serrated wings were bearing not only bombs or missiles, but also the final balance of power. Part 13 of 14. Above the Bougainville Island, in the sky where every breath was clearly audible, they carried the death of Admiral Yamamoto. Over his aircraft, previously almost unmatched as a commander, a shadow of an operation loomed like inevitable death. The sound of engine gunfire, the roar of rockets, all of this seemed inseparable from the fateful moment. As a result, the enemy's plane was shot down, the crew perished without ever witnessing victory's joy, and Yamamoto was killed. The fate of this pilot, this crew, a symbol of Japan's aviation tactics, built on the principle that only those who do not come under fire survive, seemed to be doomed. Yet, it appears this idea was mistaken. The question is, why? Why did the apparent effort to reduce losses, to make the aircraft more vulnerable in order to protect the crew, lead to the opposite outcome? The answer lies in the design of the G4M, this flying death, which was characterized by lightness and rapid firing, but seemingly created to walk straight into traps. and often perished precisely because of its own vulnerability. Over the following years, through clouds and bunkers, Japanese pilots symbolically continued their fight on this aircraft ship. In March 1945, they took off in their Bettys, armed with ochre rockets. Over Okinawa, at the heart of the decisive battle of the Pacific War, they attempted to trade their aircraft for confidence in victory. But fate had other plans. At that moment, time seemed to stand still. 18 Bettys, rushing toward the enemy, bringing death and destruction, found themselves caught in the trap of American tactics, and the F-6F Hellcat spread its wings around the periphery of this deadly system. What could the crew have thought when their usual fight turned into an ambush? Explosive waves, deafening gunfire. These battles left no living pilot behind. All 137 men perished, as if victims of their own design, built on the principle that only those who avoid fire survive. Was this compromise the foundation of their fate? That sacrifice was not a subjective choice, but the result of a flawed idea of military technology that does not protect its own. However, the story of Betty did not end with bloody battles. Its final combat flight was on August 19, when the aircraft once again took to the skies, not as a killer, not as a symbol of war. This time, it was merely a transport for a delegation returning home, a kind of caricature of the combat role of these machines. On this flight, the entire inevitability and tragedy of the killer ship was revealed. Betty was dressed in new garments, in the guise of a messenger. In its eyes looked people who, after the war, would pass by these aircraft without a second thought. But inside, they knew. For someone, this was the last journey, and for the machine, something more than just metal and glass. This final mission became a symbol that the design of Betty, all its combat functions, was a pale copy of the ideology that guided Japanese aviation. The idea of ruthless, merciless weapons meant to destroy the enemy without regard for those inside. Throughout the entire era, approximately 2,400 aircraft were produced. However, the truth lies in the demographic list. Most of them fell in combat, sacrificing their wings and iron bodies, despite the efforts of engineers and pilots. In the end, by the time the war concluded, only a few operational aircraft remained among the survivors. Their time had run out, and only legends persisted, about a machine built on the principle that only those who do not come under fire survive. Beneath this idea lay not only a strategy, but also a philosophy that forced Japanese forces to transcend human laws. In a world where design determines fate, humans become mere numbers, pawns in a misguided vision. So, the key question remains: how exactly does this idea illustrate a profound internal conflict within military strategy? It demonstrates how illusory the belief was that human life was merely a side effect of war, that efforts were focused solely on creating iron monsters, capable of withstanding blows and charging ahead. Perhaps this history is a lesson that strategy, stubbornly ignoring the human factor, inevitably leads to tragedy. What if the design of the Betty had been different, with crew protection and consideration for human lives? What would have been the cost of that choice? Maybe fewer innocents would have perished, and the Japanese air front would have taken on a completely different character. But the price paid for strict doctrine is, without exaggeration, hundreds of innocent lives, whose value was deemed less than the idea of perfect weapons. Thus ended the era of Betty, as a tragic example of error, where human sacrifices became the cost of a strategic symbol.